Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to hear Jane Rivett-Carnac, who's president of the Narre Wine and District Family History Group, and she'll be talking to us about Dead Men Do Tell Tales, all about what you can find in a cemetery. So over to you, Jane, and thank you for being our guest speaker.
Thank you. As I said, cemeteries are a lot of fun, but they can also lead you up the garden path. So today I'm going to give you a few hints on what you can't find and what you can find, and show you some examples of how you can get led astray, and hopefully give you some other information about cemeteries at the same time relevant to family history. So a few little points of history. Most early churches have a graveyard attached to them. In Scotland, it's called a kirkyard. So when you're Googling things online, if you're Googling in Scotland, don't write church graveyard, write kirkyard. Then Google will know what you're talking about. Then you have to remember that the names of cemeteries have changed over time. So it used to be called a cemetery, then it became, about 75 years ago in Australia, became a memorial park. Originally, Springvale was a necropolis, which was the city of the dead, but now it's called a botanical cemetery. So depending on the time frame, if you're using Google or you're looking, you have to keep an idea of what the cemetery may have been known as. Now, the 1830s is when the first official burial grounds opened in Victoria, and it was 1853 when the Melbourne General Cemetery opened, and that was round about where the Victorian Market is, and the cemetery then was closed and moved. 1902 is when the Springvale necropolis opened, and a year later Victoria passed the Cremation Act. And then Fawkner Cemetery, now if you're looking at Trove and you see someone's funeral notice is the new Melbourne General Cemetery, it's Fawkner Cemetery that they're talking about. Another thing is pauper funerals. Now you might wonder, what happens to people who die and there's no funds or there's no relatives to bury them? Most cemeteries had an area set aside for burials of the unknown or the paupers of the area. And in today's world, the Victorian trustees use two cemeteries for a modern pauper burial, which is the Old Boland Cemetery and the one down at Crib Point. Now, there is a sort of a list for Old Boland online with Carol's headstone photography. You go follow the links there, and it does have the names of a number of people, but you'll also find man 58 unknown. So you won't necessarily find your person, and you also won't find pauper burials listed in the newspaper or anything like that. There are 575 public cemeteries in Victoria, and 8 of those cemeteries are Indigenous cemeteries. One down at Lake Tyers, what they call the Old Cemetery, is the Indigenous cemetery. So that's just a little bit of background on our cemeteries. One thing you should note, though, if you're going to a church graveyard, before you go, get in touch with the church, see if they are going to have somebody there who can help you, because quite often there'll be memorials inside the church, not just outside. So something to think about. Now, your death certificate, if you've got your death certificate, is going to tell you at number 9 where the person is buried and the date they were buried. It's going to tell you if it was a religious service, and it will tell you who the funeral directors are, and it gives you witnesses. Now, that is going to be 100% correct. Everything else is subject to the person who gave the information. So Lorna up here is listed as being the daughter, so we would assume that she knows more or less everything about the person who's died. But you've got to remember that children didn't necessarily, depending on the time frame, didn't necessarily know all the details that they're going to be asked. So you still have to go and verify that information elsewhere. But at least in this case, you know where the cemetery is and where you're going. So moving on, we've planned a trip to a cemetery. So this one here on the left, this is the Kirkyard in Paisley in Scotland. And unfortunately, I didn't follow my own suggestion and check beforehand. But when we were there, we were lucky enough to find somebody there who led us into the church. We didn't find the graves we were looking for because they were really seriously old and illegible, but it was worth it to go. And this is Harkaway Cemetery, one of our local ones. So hopefully the information you're going to find on the headstones is going to help you with your family history research. Before you go, Google the cemetery, Google the person you're looking for, see if you can find a map, see if you can get clear details of where in the cemetery they might be, especially if you're planning on going to the cemetery on your own. You have to be aware that a lot of these cemeteries don't have anybody there on a day-to-day basis. So if you accidentally fall over a gravestone and twist your ankle, you could be lying there for some time before someone finds you. So tell someone you're going, or better still, take someone with you, because 2 pair of eyes are better than 1 pair of eyes to find a grave. Now, when you get to the cemetery, or before you go, and you're looking online, be aware that all these various registers and lists and things are all transcriptions and have got room for error in them. So when you look, and I'm going to use this lady here, Arts at Berwick Cemetery. This is actually off the old Berwick Cemetery register that was online. It's been updated, so I'm just using this as an example. And it says Leon Helena, and you go, well, that's interesting. It's either a man with a woman's name or vice versa. But it's giving you the information that the cemetery have got for what the plot number is, the date that the burial happened, not the date they died, and the register number. And you could, at the time when this register was up there, you could then do a search and you could find out who the people were either side, which is a good idea if there is no headstone to have that note. Now, this one over here from Australian Cemeteries website, here's the arts down the bottom. It's left out the Helen as the name. It says the death is the year. It's got the same matching register number from the cemetery, but they've come up with their own cemetery number, and it says RC, so we know it's in the Catholic section. But if you look at the next lot where the abbots are, because this is from the cemetery register, there's all the abbots. Because this has been done off a headstone transcription group, there's only 1 abbot listed. So you have to be aware that because the name's not there doesn't mean they're not there, and vice versa. So do a bit of hunt before you go online. So this is a New Zealand cemetery that's online. It's also been done in conjunction with the local family history group there. The only thing on here that is from the cemetery is the plot number and where they are in the cemetery. Now, the local family history group have then gone through and added in extra information, and you go, it's fabulous, but is it correct? So take notes of all these things, and then go and check it elsewhere. Don't just assume because somebody put it up there that it's right. Although I have fact-checked this one here, and I know that's 100% right. And I really enjoyed the fact that they put down who he married, who his parents are, who his siblings are. So this family history group had gone to a lot of trouble to make information available to other people. And there's quite a few groups here in Australia who are doing the same thing on Find a Grave. They're adding in extra information, but you have to be aware that you've got to go and check that information to satisfy yourself it's correct. So this is an example of a church and graveyard in New South Wales. This is St Peter's Anglican Church in Bendolba, which is in the Hunter Valley out of Dungog. This little church is now on private land, even though it's church that still holds a service once a month, and the graveyard is still available to be used. You now come through a gate, you have to be aware of shut the gate because there's cows roaming around. And it's fundamentally about maybe 20 local families, generation after generation after generation. So this photograph here, I didn't find until well after I'd been to the cemetery. This is the headstone in 2009. It's almost illegible. Later on, I found this photograph, which was taken in 1956, and it's one of those really, really tiny, 1.5 by 2 inch black and white photographs that your grandparents had, and it was reasonably good. I can blow it up to some extent, but at the time I didn't know that. So I was sitting in the cemetery thinking, oh, damn, I can't read this. Went back into Dungog, and fortunately, it's the Maitland Family History Group had done their transcriptions of the cemetery. They had produced a book. It was at the local information centre, and it was a transcription of all the details of the headstone, which had been taken before it had faded. So I got the answer to my questions, and also have found a connection to where I could get further information. And then I went and bought the book and found all the rest of the family that I hadn't known about that were there, and I still haven't been back to their graves. But at least I've got the information as to what's on those headstones. The Lover Family History Group who loves the cemetery. Now, it may be carved in stone, but that doesn't mean it's right. Dates can be wrong. Names can be wrong. They might not be in the grave. They might be in the grave, but they're not on the headstone. There's all sorts of reasons. It could be just a typo by the stonemason and nobody checked. It could be the person who gave the information believed what they gave was correct, or it could be a family misunderstanding, like the one at Harkaway. We did a walk there and we were standing at an unmarked grave, and a family member turned up and said, how do I get a headstone put on this grave? And turned out that the family had a headstone down in Wonthaggi with his name on it. He's not in the cemetery there. He's in the cemetery at Harkaway in an unmarked grave. I believe he now has a headstone. So you have to keep all those things in mind when you're going to a cemetery. So we'll have a look at some of the examples. So this is up in Donald Cemetery. And you can see here it says Jane Pittard Onley. Now, Pittard is her maiden name. She never signed her name that way. She was never referred to that way. Now, when I went to the cemetery, I was new to family history, and I knew that she lived in Donald. And I went to the cemetery and I found this headstone. I went, yippee yahoo, that's correct. Took the photo, job done. No, it wasn't. This headstone is obviously new. You can see by the dates, 1912. Those sort of headstones were not around in 1912. This headstone was put up well after John and Jane died. Jane is actually in an unmarked grave in Bendolba with her daughter. This headstone was erected later on. There is no cemetery register for the time frame because it was burnt in a fire. So I had to go back and double check. And Trove, fortunately, gave me all the details with her funeral and her death and a little obituary that, yes, she is in Bendolba with her daughter. So this one is another one of a family connection. This is up in Rockhampton in Queensland. And up here you've got John Smallwood. He is actually the only one in the grave. There's a number of his children listed. The children are in the cemetery, but they're not in this grave. There is Ellen down here. It says that she's born in 1869 and she dies in 1864. So I don't think that's right. apart from the fact the only Alan I can find is born in 1863 and dies in 1864. It wasn't until I found the cemetery register online that I could identify the children. His wife, Alan, is actually buried in Brisbane. 3 of the children who are listed on here are buried in the cemetery. I don't know where the other ones are, and so far I've only found 13 children. The other complication is Rockhampton actually has 5 cemeteries in the area, so the children could be in another cemetery. I haven't found them yet, but if I just looked at that, I would presume that all those children are in this grave, and they're not. So this is another case. This is how, Harold Holt. We all know he drowned. We all know his body was never found, but his memorial is in Melbourne General Cemetery. Now, the Ramsden family are at Harkaway, and Charles and Frank, father and son, drowned in 1902. So they're not in the grave because their bodies were never recovered, but they're clearly here on the headstone. Here's Charles and his son. That's his wife, Elizabeth, and John Arthur, who's the other son, he died a week later. He's in the grave. Elizabeth is actually buried in Ireland. But if you just walked into the cemetery and read that and didn't think about it, you'd go, oh, they're all here together. You have to dig a little bit further to find out the truth on the headstones. An unmarked grave has its own issues and problems. So this marker here is typical of some of our older cemeteries, and they put these markers in while people were making arrangements to put a headstone there or whatever. Now, if you're looking online at the registers, it won't tell you that it's not got a headstone. It just tells you the grave number or the plot number. And walking around a cemetery looking for these tiny little numbers can be very difficult. So if possible, find out what the graves are either side. So when you're walking around and looking, you've got a point of reference before you find that number. It'll just make your life so much easier. Now, what can you find on a headstone? Well, you can find the family name, nicknames, dates, births, arrival in the country, the wife's maiden name, the children, how they died, where they died, their occupation, heritage and religion, and awards and honours. Lots of things are on headstones that you don't expect to find other than the basics. So here's some more examples. This is Cheltenham Cemetery, and it's a double grave, and it tells me James and Margaret Skinner. It gives me the full date of death and that they're late of Bendolba. So that's my clue that this is a family connection to a cemetery that I have a connection to. I can look further. This one from Bunyip, these two are fabulous. This one here, Job, Nash and Sarah, gives me Cartwright's her maiden name, gives me their birth and death dates. Arrived in Melbourne from England in 1853 and 1856. They married at Windsor in 1872. They settled at Tonnenbuck. Here's the names of all their children. And remember, with the children's names, quite often they're probably the family names. So Bert's probably Albert or Herbert or some other name. But it gives you the names of the children. This one here, Francis Hocking, tells me he's known as Frank, gives me his date of death, how old he is, his wife's name, his children's names, and the fact that one of his sons is already deceased. And it tells me he served in World War I and World War II, and gives me his service numbers. So if I was doing a military research, I've got the service numbers before I even go to the National Archives. Then you've got the problem of cemetery headstones that are in another language. So this one, this French one, this is actually in the Seychelles Island. My schoolgirl French, I can get the gist of what it is, but if I couldn't do French, you would write it all out, and then you go to Mr. Google and ask him to translate it into English. the same here with this one in Harkaway Cemetery. It's actually got 3 different languages on it. It's written in German, French, and English, because Mr. Hessel, the local teacher, could actually speak 3 languages, and his wife was French. So you've got that to contend with when you're looking at your headstones. Also at Harkaway, you've got all our Lutheran German families, our local families. These headstones are starting to get very worn, and you can make the gist of it by, you know, born and death dates. But the rest of the inscription down here is very hard to read, whereas our family history group 30 years ago transcribed that headstone. It's on microfiche. There it is, even though it's written in German. But again, you can type that into Google and ask Google to translate from German to English for you if you needed extra information or couldn't work it out. This is Maryborough in Queensland, where the headstone's got 4 names on it. And again, because I'm learning more as I go along, I wanted to check who though were actually in the cemetery. And there's this tiny little plaque down the side. And it turns out there is 4 internments, and this little plaque is a World War I soldier, and his ashes were interred at a later date. And I was fortunate enough in the fact that all those details were on the cemetery's website. This is Pakenham Cemetery, and this is another case where it tells me the wife's maiden name, gives their birth and death in full, tells us that Joseph David was known as Dave, and for those of us who are doing family, it gives the names of their 4 children who were born after 1921 and are not available to research yet online. So that helps with your research. This is from Berwick Cemetery. This is the Searle grave. And when you sort of glance at it quickly, you go, oh, look, there's 2 Henrys. Oh, there's another Henry at the side. But if you don't read all the information and you just sort of glance at it, you might think there's 3 different Henrys. There isn't. This Henry is married to Jane, and that's their son. I haven't actually gone and connected Henry Whitford because those dates are different dates, but it does give me the information that Henry Whitford Searle was the secretary of the Berwick Grammar School. So I've got another avenue to go and look for more information. This is one of my favourite ones from Pakenham Cemetery. This is a man who is seriously organised. As you will see, when his wife died, he put everything on here except for his death date, because he obviously wasn't dead yet. He's left enough room for that to go in and for any future grandchildren who've been born. I don't know if it's been updated yet, but I should go back to Pakenham and see. And I thought that was, in today's world, I guess this is a bit sort of sexist, but I thought there's a man who's actually organised. These are also from Pakenham. This is telling me where someone died. This young man, Ian Bergman, is only in his 30s, and he died on the Kokoda Track. It also gives me his mother's maiden name. Adds to your story. This one here is the Raftus, and shows that they're actually buried in back in Ireland. They'd gone back to Ireland. So then you know, okay, go back and look further. So this is Coburg Cemetery, and because of where Coburg is, there's a lot of really interesting headstones with amazing information. This is erected by the Labor movement. He's actually Archibald Stewart. He's a Justice of the Peace, and he was the General Secretary of the Australian Labor Party. This grave is William Spence, gives his birth and death dates in full, and he was the inaugural president of the Amalgamated Shearers Union for Australia, and then it lists all the other organisations that he was with. and at the bottom it adds his wife in. I'm glad they left space for her. Then you can find other things about people's history. This is Beatrice Thomas at Pakenham Cemetery. Tells us her nickname is Trixie, and that she was the secretary for the Berwick Shire and the years. So it gives you an avenue of where to go to get more information. This one here, Isaac Madison, is in Coburg Cemetery. It's telling me that apart from the fact he died at the age of 84, he was a Californian 49er miner, and then he was at the Eureka Stockade and a pioneer, and that it's been erected by his grandson Percy. So you know you've got a family connection. If it was your family, you've got another link to go look at. You've also got the links to California and the Eureka Stockade for more information. Now, why should you go to a cemetery? This cemetery is the American Cemetery above Omaha Beach in Normandy, and it was on my ever-loving's bucket list of places he wanted to go. He's a bit of a World War II buff, and the reason you go to these places is because it puts things into perspective, apart from being able to find a grave. So this is Omaha Beach, and you come up this path and you're into the cemetery. So these young men, that's literally where they died, and they're buried above the cemetery. It's a very, very big cemetery. It has got a good office where you can look people up online and you can get a little map out. We didn't think we had any connections there, but we just walked around and looked at it. And it was a very emotional situation to be in a cemetery above literally where they died. Then you've also got a lot of military cemeteries around the world, and because we've had the last few years, we've had the anniversary of World War I, 75 years of World War II. There's been a lot of interest in the military graves, and there's a lot of similarity around the world. This one here is in Canada, and it's a World War I grave, and it's got that familiar shape to it that we have here in Australia. This is in France. This is one of the headstones that would have been placed. You can see there's a whole stack of names on there. That was before they were interred and put into separate graves, and the Commonwealth War graves, headstones, etc. This one here is one of the early carved headstones, and it's now in the museum at the Bridge of Pegasus in France. Now in St Kilda, we have this amazing memorial to Albert Jacka, our first VC winner. It gives all his military information, his rank and unit, his date of death and his age. The interesting thing about this grave is there is not one mention on it anywhere, back or anywhere, of any other family member, connection, parents. It's a real memorial to a soldier. So our other soldiers of World War I, assuming that the government deemed that their death was war-related, received this headstone for World War I. This one is in Pakenham Cemetery. Our main war grave cemetery for Victoria is at Springvale. It's a separate area in Springvale Cemetery, and it looks like any other Commonwealth war grave cemetery around the world. This headstone here is the New Zealand headstone for World War I, and it's in Bunyip Cemetery. So this soldier, when he went back to New Zealand, things didn't turn out. He moved to Bunyip. It tells me he's a rifle brigade. If he was my family, it gives me information of where I can go to get more information. It's my clues. Don't freeze. So the Commonwealth war graves, to keep uniformity, it was agreed that every man, regardless of his rank, would have the same type of headstone. So you've got all the white ones, which enormous, most of the time is going to be only World War One. World War II onwards, they started to bring this uniform style in. They've all got this concrete border. They've all got this little plaque on the bottom telling you it's the Commonwealth War Graves. And they've got this simple plaque here with their military insignia and a few other words, but it's very simple. And it's because every man was equal in death. Then you've got the situation where a family member has put a memorial in a family grave. This one here is at Pakenham. It's Nurse Nora Roden, and she is on a little plaque next to the large memorial for her family, and it does give you her service details on there. This one is from New Zealand. It's sort of similar. There's the service number. He's a sergeant. Tells me he's in the Maori battalion, tells me the year of death and how old he is. So you can see the similarity between Australia and New Zealand in the way they looked at their military service. Then you've got other hints to tell you as you're in the cemetery as to what area you're in. So when you see a big group of Celtic crosses like this, you're going to be in a Catholic part of the cemetery. Most of the cemeteries are divided into sections based on their religion and their very distinctive styles. So there are a number of books that have been written about the background of what the headstones mean, what the crosses mean. That's interesting and can sometimes give you more information about your family and their beliefs. This one is also at Pakenham, where you've got these beautiful little cast iron markers to tell you what section of the cemetery you've gone into. It's also showing you the change in the style of headstones. So you get idea of the time frame. So the ones with the wrought iron beds around them, as if they're lying in a bed, are a lot older than these more modern concrete versions of lying in a bed. It seems to be very much that English style versus the Roman Catholic style with these big memorials on top. And it's surprising they're not necessarily memorials for people who are important. It could just be the family remembering and I guess potentially borrowing money to put those headstones there, and potentially could even be in debt for quite some time paying for them because they weren't cheap. Then you've got in Victoria, our historical cemeteries. We've got a couple of them. Geelong Eastern Cemetery is, if your family arrived into Geelong before moving elsewhere into Victoria, especially going up to the goldfields in the 1850s. Geelong Cemetery is online. There is now transcriptions available. When I went looking for this particular grave, I hadn't done my homework properly because that's another family member next door, and I had not even bothered looking for it. This headstone here, this top part is absolutely illegible, and it says Mary Ann Abel at the bottom. Now, the interesting thing is this is William Pittard. This is his grave. He drowned in the Barwon River, and I got the information for the headstone from the Geelong Cemetery, and Mary Ann remarried, so that's her new name. Her second husband also drowned in the Barwon River, but she was buried with her first husband. The second husband is buried with his other family members. And I got all the information from the Geelong Cemetery Trust. Williamstown is one of our really old cemeteries with a lot of early pioneers. And this is on sand, so it's one of those cemeteries where walking around it can be a bit dicey. It's a bit unstable, rabbit holes everywhere, so you need to be aware of where you're walking. I like this headstone for the father. He was obviously well thought of in his family, and that's his son's headstone. He died when he came back from World War One. These ones here are really early headstones. This one says Owen Owens, and he's 23, and he was actually killed by prisoners on one of the prison hulks in Port Phillip Bay. If he was your family, you've got all this information here, which is just fabulous, because then it gives you other places to go and look. Maps are important. If you've got a map of your cemetery, this is Coburg, which I got online. You can keep it and mark where your graves are, take it with you and find them a lot easier, because it's showing you all the sections and denominations. Now, the Springvale Botanical Cemetery used to be in the Melways. So if you've got an old Melways, you can rip out the Springvale one and wander around the cemetery with it. A lot of the older cemeteries have a map at the beginning of their cemetery as you come in the front gate normally. So this gives you a help finding where they are, especially some of the bigger cemeteries. But what if you haven't got a map? Now, this is Google Earth. This is Bunyip Cemetery. And as you know, I'm a bit of a thing with cemeteries. When we do our cemetery walks, we have a map so we know where we're going. In this case, we had to make it ourselves. So Google Earth, copy it off, draw it out, and make our own map was very handy. But then if it's your family that you're doing, you can mark where your graves are as you're going. So I mentioned earlier about things you can find inside a church. So this one here on the left, this is in Walcott Parish Church in Bath in England. It's actually giving information on 3 generations, and it even mentions the mother-in-law on here. This one is at St James Church in Sydney. As you come up out of the underground there, the church is just on your left. And apart from the fact it's telling me it's erected by his fellow soldiers, it tells me that he was, treacherously murdered by the Aboriginal natives. So it gives me information of how he died, but also avenues for other places to look. Outside a church, this is St Anne's in Ryde. This is one of the oldest church graveyards in Sydney. This is for Thomas Sapsford, and on here it tells me he was the late city architect for Sydney. So that gave me information of other avenues to look. Also that his son is buried with him, and his son was only 13. This one is in the same cemetery, and it's for John Small. He was a first fleeter. The plaque here is telling me that the family have removed their descendant to Field of Mars Cemetery, which is a more modern, bigger cemetery. Underneath here, this is a biography on John Small, first fleeter, and his history and his family. So even though he's no longer in the cemetery, there is still a marker because he was a First Fleet soldier. Cremations. Now, cremations are a world unto their own. Don't presume that because you've been cremated in Springvale Cemetery, you're going to be buried in ashes in the cemetery there. In today's world, your ashes could be all over the place. This is Christchurch, Dungog, and the nearest crematorium is down at Gosford. So if you're looking for your people in Gosford, they could quite possibly be up here. Now, cremations, it was accepted practice initially that you had the ashes in an urn, and you kept that urn. It was also a cheaper method, and it was better for the cemeteries because they could put more people in a smaller place. So another thing to remember is, if you're looking at Catholic families, the Catholic Church didn't allow you to have cremations until 1965. So that is another thing to be aware of. Also, the dates of when cremations started. So if someone was like Uncle Dave, he's been on the mantelpiece, and Auntie Mabel dies, and you go, well, what happened to Uncle Dave? Well, his ashes may have been put with hers, and you think, well, okay, how can I find that out? Track down who the funeral parlour was, who was looking after them, and see if his ashes were put in her casket with her, or they might have been interred in the grave together. Or it could be like when my mum died, we went and looked and decided we didn't particularly like where Dad was, so we had Dad shifted, and Mum and Dad are now together in Bunurong Cemetery. But if you go online and you look up my dad's name, it infers that he's still there in Springvale when he's not. So you have to keep your mind open as to where someone could be when you're talking about cremations. I know of a lady who, after they sold the house, they had to go back to the new owners of the house and say, excuse me, Dad's in the garage, can we get him out? They had forgotten his ashes had been in the shed for quite some time, and they'd forgotten he was there, and had to go back and get him. So you think, we have our ashes spread in so many places now. They could be spread down at a beach, they could be anywhere, but there's no, for the future generations, there's nowhere to go to find that out. If you look at the cemetery details online, it will say they've been scattered in the cemetery, they've been picked up or collected. They won't tell you who, because that's private. So I'm not sure how the future generations are going to find us. They're going to have to go hunting. Then you've got headstones like this one. It just says mother and father. That's it. All it says. There is nothing else. Not only is there nothing else, there is no register for that particular cemetery. It's a small rural cemetery, and it just says mother and father. So I'm not sure how you would, unless you sort of go close enough, I think that's mine. I'm not sure how you would track down your particular person if there's no register for the cemetery. And there are lots of cemeteries that don't have registers for a variety of reasons. And there is also cemeteries where people were buried before the cemetery was officially a cemetery. So you will continue to run into the proverbial brick walls. Couple of things when you're at a cemetery. If you're walking around, turn your phone off. That's just obvious. Park your car where you're not going to block other people. As I said at the beginning, take someone with you. Be aware that the ground in a lot of these cemeteries is full of rabbit holes and other animal holes. Be respectful. If you happen to come to a cemetery and there's a service taking place and it's near the grave that you want to go to, go up and look at some of the other graves and come back. Be practical and sensible. Take photos, but don't try and clean headstones. Depending on what the headstone is made out of, you can actually make it worse. A soft brush to brush things away, that might work. If you're trying to take a photograph, this one here, if you poured water onto it, you know, like you've got a bottle of water because it's a hot day, if you poured water over the name, that will make it a bit clearer, but that's about all you should really do. The other thing that's happening in today's world is, apart from the fact we're spreading our ashes at beaches and off mountaintops, is you can have ashes turned into funeral jewellery. Now, the technology is such that they can make a gemstone which you can set into a ring or a necklace, but I don't think you can put a plaque on it, but at least you could engrave the back of it and hand it on to the family. And if you think about it, that's just an extension of the funeral jewellery of the 1800s, when they would take hair and they'd plait it and they'd wrap it around a photograph and have it in a locket. So it's not that sort of icky, but it's the things that they're doing today. So it's just going to make it harder for us in the future to find our graves. So that's it, other than not everybody has a grave. Not every grave has a headstone. Not every headstone is correct. Not every cemetery has its register searchable online. Not every grave has been photographed and available online. And sometimes you just have to stand at the grave to see the full story. And thank you very much for listening.